My name is Justina Vance. I'm 31 years old. For a decade, my mother told her friends at the country club that I was finding myself abroad, because admitting her daughter was a paramedic was a truth she couldn't stomach. While my brother Julian collected surgical fellowships and inheritance promises, I was collecting 12-hour shifts and the scent of diesel and adrenaline. My family viewed my life as a blue-collar phase, a gritty rebellion against a white-collar legacy. But on the night my father was rushed to the ICU, while my mother was busy texting the family PR firm to handle the optics, a lead surgeon asked a single question that would strip the Vances of their arrogance. What they didn't know was that my father had been watching me from the shadows for years. He knew exactly who would be steady enough to hold his life in their hands, and it wasn't the golden boy with the Ivy League degree. The Vances were medical royalty, the kind of family whose name appeared on hospital wings and research grants. My mother, Beatrice, was a master of social standing, and Julian was already being groomed to take over as chief of surgery at the city's most prestigious clinic. By 2026, the Vance estate was valued at over $120 million. I was the daughter who chose the street over the suite. While Julian was learning to navigate hospital politics, I was learning how to keep a heart beating in the back of a swaying ambulance at 3 a.m. My parents' response wasn't pride. It was a cold, polished shame. To them, I wasn't a lifesaver. I was a glorified driver, someone who handled the messes they were too refined to touch. 4 years, I accepted my role as the family's greatest disappointment, the one relegated to the service entrance while they walked through the front door. But as I stood in that ICU, still in my rugged uniform with dirt on my boots, the power dynamic of the Vance empire was about to be turned inside out by a secret my father had kept for 3 long years. The 4 a.m. rain in the city doesn't feel like water. It feels like cold grease. I was kneeling in a puddle of it on 5th Avenue, my knees digging into the pavement while I performed rhythmic compressions on the chest of a man whose heart had decided to quit 3 minutes ago. My partner, Silas, was at the head, counting the rhythm of the bag valve mask. Switching in 3, 2, 1. We moved with a synchronization that only comes from years of shared silence and high-stakes chaos. This was my world. It was a world of bleeping monitors, the metallic tang of blood, and the desperate, ragged gasps of people clawing their way back to the living. As the man's pulse flickered back under my palms, a weak, thready victory, I felt that familiar hum of purpose. At this moment, I wasn't disappointed. I was the thin line between a grieving family and a miracle. After we handed him off to the trauma team at the municipal hospital, I climbed back into the rig. My uniform was damp, a smear of road grime streaked across my cheek, and my knuckles ached from the cold. I pulled my phone from my pocket, expecting a status update from dispatch. Instead, the screen glowed with a notification from a contact simply labeled, Mother. My heart did a strange, uncomfortable somersault. We hadn't spoken in 3 months, not since I'd missed Julian's promotion gala because of a mass casualty pileup on the I-95. I tapped the message. Your father has had a major stroke. We are at St. Jude's VIP wing. Do not show up to the hospital, Justina. Julian is handling everything with the specialists, and your presence in that uniform would only embarrass us and confuse the donors. Stay away. We will call you when there is news. I stared at the words until they blurred. Stay away. It wasn't just a request, it was an order. I looked down at my hands. They were the same hands that had just shocked a heart back to life, the same hands that had intubated a toddler last week, yet in my mother's eyes, they were only capable of bringing shame. To Beatrice Vance, I wasn't a medical professional. I was a social liability. Silas glanced over at me, his brow furrowing. Everything okay, Vance? You look like you just saw a ghost. Just a reminder, I said, my voice sounding hollow even to my own ears. I turned the phone off and shoved it into the charging dock. Just a reminder that some people would rather die with their dignity intact than be saved by the wrong person. I told myself I would obey. I told myself I'd go back to the station, scrub the city off my skin, and wait for the official update. But as Silas pulled the ambulance back into traffic, the weight of the secret I'd been carrying, a conversation with my father 3 years ago, started to press against my chest. I didn't head for the station. Instead, I found myself pulling my beat-up SUV into the parking garage of St. Jude's 30 minutes later. The VIP wing was a fortress of glass and hushed tones, a world away from the chaotic sirens of my shift. As I stepped toward the private entrance, I caught my reflection in the tinted windows. I looked exactly like the nightmare my mother feared, hair matted from the rain, navy cargo pants stained with saline and road grit, and the Vance patch on my shoulder looking like a cruel irony. I reached the double mahogany doors of the east wing, but before I could even touch the handle, a hand moved to intercept me. 2 security guards, dressed in suits that cost more than my monthly rent, stepped into my path. "Service entrance is around the back, miss," the taller one said, his voice flat and rehearsed. "I'm not here to make a delivery," I said, keeping my voice low. "I'm Justina Vance. My father is in room 402. The guard didn't move. He glanced at a digital tablet in his hand, his eyes scanning a list. "I have orders from Mrs. Vance. Only authorized family and medical staff are permitted on this floor. Your name is specifically flagged, ma'am. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." The sting of it was sharper than the cold rain outside. Beatrice hadn't just sent a text, she'd put me on a blacklist. I could see them through the glass partition, the authorized family. My mother was sitting on a velvet settee, draped in a pashmina, speaking in hushed tones to Julian. My brother looked every bit the savior in his pristine white coat, his posture exuding the calm authority of a man who had never seen a patient outside of a sterilized room. "I'm a paramedic," I said, my voice rising just enough to catch the attention of a passing nurse. "I have a right to see my father's chart." "You have the right to move along before we escort you out," the guard countered. I felt the familiar heat of shame rising in my throat, that old urge to turn around and disappear just to keep the peace. But then I remembered the weight of the wooden box tucked under the seat of my car, the one my father had given me during a secret lunch 3 years ago. "Justina," he had told me, his eyes uncharacteristically somber, "the others are good for the celebration. But if the walls ever start falling down, you're the only one I trust to find the exit." "Is there a problem here?" The voice was sharp and clinical. I turned to see Dr. Eris Thorne, the head of neurology, flanking the guards. He looked at the security team, then at my uniform, and finally at my face. "She's unauthorized, doctor," the guard explained. Mrs. Vance was very clear. Dr. Thorne didn't look at the guard's tablet. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. It was almost like recognition. "The patient's vitals are crashing," he said, ignoring the security protocol entirely. "And I don't need a socialite or a plastic surgeon right now. I need the person named in the emergency binder." He pushed past the guards and held the door open for me. "Miss Vance, we've been waiting for you." The moment I stepped into the ICU, the air changed. The hushed, expensive silence was shattered by the rhythmic, frantic chirping of the cardiac monitor. Beatrice stood abruptly, her pashmina sliding off her shoulder like a discarded skin. "Justina, I told you specifically." "Not now, mother," I snapped, my eyes already darting to the monitor. I didn't need a medical degree to read the story the screen was telling. My father's mean arterial pressure was plummeting, and his heart rate was compensatory, tachycardic and weak. Julian stepped forward, blocking my path to the bed. He looked like a mannequin for a medical textbook, his white coat crisp, his stethoscope draped perfectly around his neck. "Justina, get out. You're overstepping. I've already consulted with the surgical team. We're prepping him for a decompressive hemicraniectomy. It's the only way to relieve the intracranial pressure." I stopped dead. "A hemicraniectomy? Julian, look at his labs. He's in a hypercoagulable state. If you take him to the OR now and open his skull, he'll bleed out before you even see the dura. His heart can't take the anesthesia, let alone the trauma of the procedure." Julian's face flushed a deep, indignant red. "I am a surgeon, Justina. I spend my life in the theater. You spend yours in the back of a truck giving out aspirin and oxygen. Don't you dare try to lecture me on surgical intervention." "I'm lecturing you on survival," I countered, my voice dropping to that low, steady register I used when a scene was going sideways. "You want to perform a heroic surgery so you can tell the board you did everything possible. I want to use TPA and targeted hypothermia to stabilize him first. If you cut him now, you're signing his death warrant." "Enough." Beatrice's voice was a whip crack. "Julian is the doctor here, Justina. You are a technician, a helper. Now, leave this room before you cause a scene that we can't fix." She turned to Dr. Thorne, her expression shifting into a practiced, elegant plea. "Doctor, please ignore her. My son has my full authorization to proceed with whatever surgery he deems necessary. I assume the paperwork is ready." Dr. Thorne didn't look at the clipboard in his hand. He looked at the family, his gaze lingering on Julian's arrogance and Beatrice's desperation. Then, he stepped toward the bedside and looked at me. "Actually, Mrs. Vance," Thorne said, his voice echoing in the small room, "your authorization is no longer required." "And Dr. Julian Vance? You are a brilliant surgeon, but you are not the primary decision-maker in this room." He pulled a notarized document from the blue emergency binder at the foot of the bed. "Arthur Vance filed a durable power of attorney and a specific medical directive 3 years ago. It states that in the event of neurological incapacitation, all medical decisions, including surgical consent, are to be made by one person." The silence that followed was so heavy it felt like it was pressing the oxygen out of the room. Beatrice's hand went to her throat. "What are you talking about? It's always been Julian." "No," Thorne said, extending a pen toward me. "It's Justina. The patient's directive specifically notes that he chose the daughter who understands the reality of the brink. Miss Vance, the oar is on standby, but the TPA is prepped. It's your call. What are we doing?" I looked at my brother's shocked face, then at the man dying in the bed. For the first time in 31 years, the disappointment was the only one with the power to speak. The silence in the room wasn't peaceful. It was a vacuum. My mother's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Julian looked like he'd been struck, his hands hovering over the bed rail as if he still held the right to touch the man lying there. "There must be a mistake," Julian finally choked out, his voice cracking. "I'm his son. I'm a surgeon at this hospital. My father would never. He wouldn't leave his life in the hands of someone who doesn't even have a medical license." "He didn't leave it in the hands of a license, Julian," I said, my voice vibrating with a calm I didn't know I possessed. "He left it in the hands of someone who knows how to make a choice when the clock is ticking." I didn't look at my mother. I couldn't. I kept my eyes on the monitor, watching the erratic wave of my father's heart. I knew what the family saw, a daughter who had failed their expectations. But I knew what my father had seen 3 years ago in that mahogany box he'd handed me. He had seen a woman who didn't blink at the sight of blood, who didn't let ego cloud her judgment, and who understood that sometimes the most heroic thing you can do is wait. "Dr. Thorne," I said, my voice steady, "cancel the oar. We are not cutting. Start the TPA protocol immediately. I want his core temperature to drop to 34 degrees. We're going to give his brain a chance to rest before we even think about a scalpel." "Justina, you are killing him." Beatrice finally found her voice, screaming it loud enough that the nurses at the station turned their heads. She lunged toward me, her manicured nails catching the sleeve of my uniform. "You're doing this out of spite. Because we didn't want you here? Because you're jealous of your brother?" "I'm doing this because I'm the only one in this room who isn't thinking about how the obituary will read," I said, gently but firmly unhooking her fingers from my arm. "I'm thinking about the man on the table." Julian stepped in, his face inches from mine, his professional mask completely shattered. "If he dies because of this delay, I will make sure you are held criminally negligent. I will strip you of that patch on your shoulder and make sure you never even drive a taxi in this city again." "Then you'd better pray I'm right," I replied. Dr. Thorne nodded to the nursing staff, and the room exploded into a different kind of motion. The surgical residents filed out, looking confused, while the ICU nurses moved in with cooling blankets and medication vials. Beatrice was led to the corner of the room by a patient advocate, her sobs turning into a low, jagged hiss of resentment. Julian stood at the foot of the bed, his arms crossed, a vulture waiting for the inevitable failure. I didn't move. I pulled a chair up to the head of the bed and sat down. I reached out and took my father's hand, the hand that hadn't held mine in years. It was cold, but the pulse was still there, a stubborn, rhythmic thumping against my thumb. "I'm here, Dad," I whispered, loud enough for my mother and brother to hear. "The helper is here. And we're doing it my way." The nurses worked in a blurred frenzy of plastic tubing and saline bags. While the cooling blankets began their slow, rhythmic hum, I retreated to the small waiting alcove just outside the room. Julian and Beatrice were still in the hallway, their voices rising in a frantic negotiation with a hospital administrator, but I tuned them out. I reached for my bag and pulled out the small mahogany box. I hadn't opened it since the day my father gave it to me at that quiet diner in Queens, miles away from the polished marble of his usual life. "When the time comes, Justina," he had said, "they will try to tell you that you don't belong in the room. This will remind you why you do. The brass latch clicked, a sharp, lonely sound in the sterile hallway. Inside was a single envelope and an old, laminated photograph. The photo was from 20 years ago. Julian standing on a stage receiving a middle school award, looking straight at the camera with a rehearsed, plastic smile. But the background caught my breath. There was my father, slumped in his chair, clutching his chest in the middle of what we now knew was his first minor heart attack. My mother was looking at Julian, clapping. Julian was looking at the trophy. Only I, a 10-year-old girl in the corner of the frame, was looking at our father, my hand already reaching for his, my face twisted with the realization that something was terribly wrong. I opened the letter. The handwriting was shaky, written in the weeks following that lunch. Justina, I've spent my life building a name that your mother and brother wear like a suit of armor. They love the crown, but they are terrified of the thorns. I watched Julian that day at his ceremony. He saw me gasping, and he looked away because my weakness threatened his moment. Your mother looked away because she refuses to acknowledge anything that isn't perfect. But you have never looked away from the blood or the pain. You ran toward me then, and I know you've been running toward the fires of this city ever since. I don't want a surgeon who thinks he's a god deciding when to flip the switch. I want a daughter who knows that life is messy, unglamorous, and worth fighting for in the dirt. Don't let them bully you. You are the only one who truly knows how to see me. A hot, stinging tear hit the parchment, blurring the ink of his signature. All those years I thought I was invisible. He had been documenting my peripheral vision. He hadn't been ignoring my career. He had been studying it. The door to the ICU suite swung open. Julian marched in, a tall, balding man in an expensive charcoal suit trailing behind him. "This is Mr. Sterling from the family's legal office," Julian announced, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and fury. "We've reviewed the document Thorne showed us. We are filing for an emergency injunction on the grounds of undue influence. You manipulated a sick old man into signing that power of attorney, Justina. And until a judge hears us, you are barred from making further clinical decisions." I stood up, the letter clutched in my hand, and looked at the lawyer. "Mr. Sterling, you've known my father for 30 years. Do you really want to be the man who helps Julian Vance kill him for the sake of an ego-driven surgery?" The lawyer, Sterling, looked at me, then at the letter in my hand, and finally at the frantic, sweating mess that was my brother. He was a man who lived by the letter of the law, but even he could see the spirit of the room was decaying. "Julian," Sterling began, his voice cautious, "if the directive is notarized and the capacity was established at the time of signing." "I don't care about the paperwork," Julian roared, his polished veneer finally falling away to reveal the terrified boy underneath. "I am the surgeon. I am the one who belongs here." Suddenly, a high-pitched, sustained wail cut through the argument. It wasn't the rhythmic chirping of the monitor anymore. It was the flatline of a VTach alarm transitioning into cardiac arrest. "He's coding," a nurse screamed from inside the glass. Julian froze. He stood there, his hands trembling, his medical mind seemingly locked behind a wall of panic. He had spent his career in scheduled operating rooms with a dozen assistants and a controlled environment. He didn't know the brink. I didn't wait for the lawyer or the injunction. I dropped the box and the letter, and I ran. I hit the door with my shoulder, sliding into the room just as the lead nurse reached for the crash cart. "I've got it!" I yelled, the paramedic in me taking total control. I didn't see my father as the man who had ignored me for 20 years. I saw him as a VSA, ventricular standstill. I leaped onto the bed, straddling my father's chest, and began deep, rhythmic compressions. 1, 2, 3, 4. The bed frame groaned under the pressure. "Julian, get in here." Beatrice wailed from the doorway. "Save him. Do something." Julian stepped into the room, his face pale as a sheet. He looked at the crash cart, at the paddles, at the chaos. He reached for the defibrillator, but his hands were shaking so violently he nearly dropped the leads. He was looking at the monitor, his eyes wide, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He was paralyzed. "Clear," I shouted, watching the nurse charge the unit. Julian didn't move. He was standing in the hot zone, staring at the paddles. "Julian, move," I barked. "Clear the bed." He stumbled back, tripping over a monitor lead, falling against the wall. I took the paddles from the nurse. I didn't need a surgical suite. I needed the rhythm. Shuck. My father's body arched off the bed. I immediately went back to compressions. 1, 2, 3. Check rhythm, I commanded. The monitor showed a jagged, beautiful spark. A sinus rhythm. Weak but there. I stayed on the bed, my breath coming in heavy bursts, my hand still hovering over his heart. I looked up to see Sterling, the lawyer, standing in the doorway. He wasn't looking at the surgeon in the white coat who was currently shaking on the floor. He was looking at the helper in the dirt-stained uniform who had just snatched a life back from the void. "Mr. Sterling," Dr. Thorne said quietly, stepping into the room and checking my father's pupils. "I believe the question of undue influence has just been answered by a lack of performance." I climbed down from the bed, my knuckles white, and looked at my mother. She was staring at Julian, then at me, the hierarchy of her world collapsing in real time. The chaos of the code had settled into the rhythmic, mechanical hum of a stabilized room. The adrenaline was beginning to ebb, leaving behind a cold, crystalline clarity. I stood by the ventilator, my chest still heaving, while Julian remained slumped against the far wall. The golden sun looked diminished, his white coat wrinkled and his authority stripped away by the simple fact that when the heart stopped, he had frozen. Sterling, the lawyer, stepped fully into the room. He didn't look at Julian. He looked at me with a profound, sobering respect. He tucked his legal briefs back into his leather portfolio. "I've seen enough," Sterling said quietly. "The petition for an injunction is withdrawn. Miss Vance, the floor is yours." Beatrice let out a strangled cry, reaching for Sterling's arm. "You can't just leave. He's a surgeon. She's a driver." "She's the only one who didn't let him die, Beatrice," Sterling countered, his voice like iron. "If I were you, I would stop talking and start watching. You might learn something about your daughter." I turned to Dr. Thorne. The weight of the power of attorney was no longer a burden. It was a tool. "Dr. Thorne, initiate the targeted temperature management now. I want him at 34 degrees Celsius. And I want a continuous EEG monitor placed immediately. We need to catch any subclinical seizure activity before it causes more damage." "On it," Thorne replied, signaling the nurses. Julian finally stood up, his face a mask of bitter humiliation. "You think you've won? You're just delaying the inevitable. He'll be a vegetable, and it'll be on your head." I walked over to my brother until we were inches apart. I didn't see the brilliant surgeon anymore. I saw the boy who had looked away from the photo 20 years ago. "Julian, you are no longer part of the medical team. As power of attorney, I am officially barring you from this floor. You can wait in the cafeteria, or you can go home. But if you step foot in this ICU again, I'll have security remove you for interfering with life-saving care." "Justina," Beatrice gasped. "He's your brother. And he's a distraction," I said, turning my back on them both. "Mother, you can stay in the waiting lounge. But the moment you prioritize optics over his oxygen levels, you're gone too." I signed the cooling protocol orders with a hand that didn't shake. As the cooling blankets began to circulate the chilled fluid, I watched my father's vitals settle into a forced, icy peace. I sat back down in the vinyl chair, the letter from the mahogany box still tucked into my waistband. I was no longer the invisible first responder. I was the architect of his survival. The following 72 hours were a masterclass in patience. I didn't leave the room. I slept in the vinyl chair, waking to the sound of every alarm and the scratch of every nurse's pen. Outside the glass, the Vance empire was in a tailspin. Beatrice had attempted to call the hospital board, only to find that my father's directive was ironclad and that Dr. Thorne had documented Julian's clinical paralysis during the code. They were powerless, forced to watch from the hallway like strangers. On the fourth morning, we began the slow process of rewarming. This was the most dangerous part, the wake-up. If Julian was right, my father would be a shell. If I was right, the brain had been protected by the ice. "Vitals are stable," Dr. Thorne whispered, checking the pupil response. "We're titrating the sedation off now." I stood by the bed, my heart hammering a rhythm more frantic than any siren I'd ever followed. "Dad," I said, my voice thick. "It's just Ty. If you can hear me, I need a sign." For a long time, there was only the hiss of the ventilator. Then, a flicker. A twitch in the right hand, the same hand I had been holding for 3 days. His eyelids fluttered, struggling against the weight of the drugs, until they finally opened. His eyes were unfocused, darting around the sterile room until they landed on me. The monitor spiked, not with distress, but with recognition. "Just, Ty," he rasped, the sound barely audible behind the tube. I let out a breath I'd been holding since I received that first text message. "I'm here. You're at St. Jude's. You had a stroke, but we've got you." At that moment, the door pushed open. Beatrice and Julian stood there, having seen the activity on the monitors. Beatrice's face was a mask of calculated relief, already reaching for her phone to call her social circle. Julian looked at the EEG, his eyes searching for a flaw, a reason to still be right. "Arthur," Beatrice cried, rushing toward the bed. "Oh, thank God." "Julian, tell the specialists he's awake. We need to move him to a private recovery suite immediately." Arthur's gaze shifted from me to them. The recognition in his eyes sharpened, but it wasn't warm. He looked at Julian, the son who had looked away 20 years ago and who had wanted to cut him open 4 days ago. Then he looked at Beatrice, who was already talking over him. He squeezed my hand. It was a firm, deliberate pressure. With his other hand, he slowly shook his finger toward the door, then back at me. "Only her," he croaked. The room went cold. Beatrice froze mid-sentence. Julian's face turned a ghostly, ashen gray. It wasn't just a medical preference anymore. It was a verdict. "Arthur, don't be ridiculous," Beatrice stammered. "Julian is a surgeon. He's been managing your case." "No," Arthur said, his voice gaining a jagged strength. He looked at the golden sun, and then at the wife who valued the Vance name more than the man wearing it. "She stayed. You left." I stood tall in my rumpled navy cargos, the Vance patch on my shoulder finally feeling like it belonged there. "You heard him," I said, my voice echoing with the quiet authority of a woman who no longer needed their permission to exist. "Out. All of you." The transition from the ICU to the rehabilitation wing was more than a medical relocation. It was a changing of the guard. Arthur Vance survived, but the version of the Vance family that prioritized optics over life did not. A month after the stroke, I stood in my father's study at the family estate. The air was thick with the scent of old leather and mahogany, a room I had been banned from as a child because my work boots might scuff the floors. Now, the boots stayed. Beatrice and Julian sat across from me. For the first time, they weren't sitting on a pedestal. They were waiting for my instructions. Julian had been placed on administrative leave at the hospital following Dr. Thorne's report on his conduct, and Beatrice's social standing had crumbled as the truth of the private medical crisis leaked into the city's gossip columns. "I've spoken with Dad," I said, placing a new set of legal documents on the desk. "He's stepping down as chairman of the Vance Medical Foundation. He's tired of the crown." "And let me guess," Julian sneered, though the fire was gone from his eyes. "You're taking it? The paramedic is going to run $100 million foundation." "No," I replied, meeting his gaze. "I'm a paramedic, Julian. I'm staying in the field. I'm staying where the work actually happens. But I am appointing the board. And the first order of business is shifting the foundation's entire budget." I slid the proposal forward. No more museum wings. No more gala-funded vanity projects. We're building a network of community-based rapid response centers. We're funding specialized training for first responders in low-income districts. We're investing in the people who are in the dirt, saving lives before they ever reach your air-conditioned suites. Beatrice looked at the numbers, her face pale. "This will ruin our standing. The donors expect." "The donors can expect to see the Vance name on the side of ambulances, not plaques," I interrupted. "You wanted a legacy, Mother. This is it. A legacy of actually being there when the heart stops." Later that evening, I sat on the porch with my father. He was in a wheelchair, his speech still slow but his mind as sharp as a scalpel. He looked out over the sprawling lawn, then down at my hands, reddened from a day of training new recruits. "You did good, Justina," he whispered. "I just did my job, Dad." "No," he shook his head. "You saw. Everyone else closed their eyes. You kept yours open." I looked at my phone. A notification from dispatch flashed across the screen. "Multi-vehicle accident. 3 blocks away. All units respond." I stood up and kissed his forehead. I didn't need a surgical gown or a socialite's approval. I had the wooden box, the letter, and a father who finally knew my name. As I ran toward my SUV, the sirens began to wail in the distance, a sound that used to represent my family's shame, but now sounded exactly like a victory. I wasn't the invisible daughter anymore. I was the one who ran toward the fire. And for the first time in 31 years, I wasn't running away from my name. I was taking it with me into the heart of the city.